represents it. So let's say that's a missing data set. And so once again, you see the people who have the resources to give that data away, such as the police who know that, have no incentive to actually do that. And then those who might have an incentive to get it, the public, we don't have the resources to actually get that. And so you see this mismatch all the time. If anything, I would say this is one of the most, like the primary reason that data won't exist in certain spaces, is that there's this mismatch between resources and incentives. The next one is that sometimes the very act of having to collect data will take more work than it gives to have that data. And so you see this a lot in things around sexual harassment, for instance, where a lot of people will talk about the very burden of needing to report that and how actually doing that as one person doesn't feel like it's worth what it will give to have that data set out in the world. And there are some strategies that different academics have suggested for dealing with this, but you see this in a lot of kind of very difficult data sets. The third one is really interesting, and this is the very first example that I showed you with those maps, is that you have some spaces that just resist metrification, where there are things that they just can't be fit into the boxes that we need them to be. And so, as I said, all of those places on the map, all of those, they resist metrification. They have these particular characteristics that make that the case. But then also something as simple as cache. In our world today, we're increasingly changing so many things to credit transactions. And credit cards are great because you can track all of that information really easily, which is great in a world where you can make money off of data and being able to track things. And so cache, in many ways, represents a problem in this space because it's not as easy to track it. And an example of that is that in the US, we don't know how much of our currency is outside of the US, because there's no way of actually being able to collect it. And there are a lot of statisticians at the Federal Reserve who have spent a long time thinking about this and trying to figure out how much of a problem it is and what it is that they want to do with it, or just thinking about that issue. And then this last one is that sometimes there are benefits to non-existence. And this is sort of a meta reason, in that for every data set that doesn't exist, someone is benefiting from not having it. But usually the person or the entity that benefits is the one that has more power. And when I'm talking about benefits to non-existence, what I mean is that there are moments in which people who do have less power actually will intentionally try not to collect data or try not to let data be put out there. And an example of this, again, sorry, all my examples are very state-centric. An example of this is, again, in sanctuary cities, places like San Francisco, when they have these municipal ID cards. These are meant to give undocumented immigrants a chance to have some form of identification. And what they'll do is get data to create the card and then immediately delete the data, because they know that if anything should happen, that could be this data set that could be used, so that an administration that is not very happy with immigrants could come in, or with undocumented immigrants could try to get that data. And we've seen that happen multiple times already. And so you can see that this is a strategy in a way. So this project, Missing Datasets, it's in some ways a research project, but it also involves me working with people who are missing data and want to do something about this. So this is a group that I worked with a couple years ago. This is a group of Asian American actors on Broadway. And what they found, Asian American performers, and what they realized is that there's actually no data on the ethnicity of performers on Broadway. And they started to think, perhaps this is affecting us in some ways. We think that we're not being represented as much as some of our counterparts, but we don't really know that. And so they tried to talk to various people in the field about that. And the pushback that they got was, that's not true, you can't prove it. So then they said, okay, well, let's do it. And so they ended up spending 5 years collecting all of this data. And it was this really interesting case in that they're all performers, they're Broadway actors, so they know a lot of people in that space. So they were able to kind of get this complete data set. So I spent 5 years documenting it, and then I came on at the end and helped them make sense of it and helped them do a bit of data analysis and kind of sort through all of this. Then I wrote an article for them that talked about this exact issue. And they were able to collect this data. And what they found, we did a lot, in this article we have a lot of different charts and we talk a lot about the analysis of it and various metrics for thinking through this problem. But this is the chart that I think is the most just demonstrative. And you can see Asian American is the light blue color. And you can see they're really only represented in one show. It's called The King and I. It's set in modern day Thailand. And the main characters are still white. So they're like all the background characters in that show. And then they're not really represented in other things. And so what they found was that indeed this is what they suspected was actually true. And we also saw some other interesting things, which is very specific to Broadway and New York environment, which is that when people talk about this question of diversity and inclusion, that at least as it unfolds in Broadway is not necessarily that all shows will involve lots of people of different backgrounds, but that you'll have one show that focuses on one group, and then another show that focuses on another group, and so on. And then we also found that in times of economic crisis, that those are the shows that get cut first. And there are really only two examples of Broadway shows that go against this model. One of them is Hamilton, really interestingly. So there's a whole discussion we can have around what that, like actually the economic benefits and various cultural benefits of pushing back against that. But that was a lot that we found just by kind of going through that data. And that was really interesting. It was really nice because it was very smooth and like we had a missing data set and then we were able to fill it. But the thing that I like about this project is not just working with people, but kind of exploring moments when it's not that tidy. And as I said, I'm an artist, so another extension of this project is this art piece that I have, which is called The Library of Missing Data Sets. And what this is, it's a show that I've exhibited in a lot of places, a piece I've exhibited in a lot of places, and it consists of a filing cabinet, and in it are all of these empty folders, and they're all labeled with various missing data sets. And so it's exhibited like this, so people can kind of go and rifle through and look at what's missing. And I really enjoy showing this piece because what happens invariably is that somebody will try to kind of peek into the folder, and then they'll realize there's nothing in it, and then they'll click for them. They'll be like, oh, because the data is missing. It's not there. And it's great. This is exactly what I mean, and having that moment where all of a sudden something that was sort of abstract makes sense in a very tangible sort of way. And so I've shown this in a lot of places, and wherever I show it, I try to change it so that it is representing the missing data of that particular area. Right now it's showing in Amsterdam, and so most of the data sets in it are very specific to the Netherlands. But this was a show in New York, and so a lot of that was much more about the New York setting. And I really, like I said, I really just enjoy what this piece gives in terms of both understanding the general idea of what I'm trying to do, but also getting that, seeing how all of these are all different types of data sets and how they all kind of match up against each other when they're together. This idea of the collective is really, really interesting to me. So a lot of this, as I've said, has had to do with data, but I said this does connect to artificial intelligence and to machine learning, and to the very title of this entire exhibition. And one of those reasons is that thinking about missing data is a really great way to actually enter some of the issues when it comes to artificial intelligence. One of those is that AI is a data-driven technology. It has to do with the data that's being fed in there. And so we have this core issue, which is always, what is the data we're actually collecting, and what are we able to collect? Because if we're missing something, then everything else that we do based on that is going to reflect that. We're going to have those same ripple effects. And this is Gladys Bentley. I recently wrote a piece on her. She's from 1912, and she was this very interesting kind of figure in the Harlem Renaissance, this cross-dresser. That's how she kind of identified herself. And you can see this is a photo where she's being fed into one of the industry standard image recognition system and image classification system. And you can see part of the thing around her is that she refused to be defined in categories. And so she's here, there's one of these things that says that she's being read as a man. And part of her entire like work was pushing against what it meant to be defined as a man versus defined as a woman, and so on. And so a lot of the work that I have been doing lately has been thinking about how do we make sense of these, how do we take these ideas, these data-driven technologies, and how they're represented, how do we make sense of them now as we're moving into these different spaces and we're thinking about these different technologies that are being kind of pushed out over society. And so this is called the People's Guide to Artificial Intelligence. This is a guide that I have worked on with a collaborator named Diana Nucera, which is being released in literally a week, I think. And in this, the point that we kind of have a few big points that we want to make about AI, but one of them is this idea of power and scale. When I talk about power, what I mean is how all of the technologies we use can't be divorced from the context that they're in. And so a lot of these conversations that we do need to have around AI and and AI-based technologies is who has the processing power, who has the computing power to make sense of all of this, who has the financial incentive to be using these things. But then the other thing that we're interested in is who gets to have these conversations and who gets to weigh in on these debates. And so the reason why we made this guide is because we both were thinking about what it meant to be in spaces where lots of experts are talking about the effects of AI, but also talking about the fact that these effects will be rolled out to everyone and that they won't be equal. And so we made this. We've got a lot of things in here. We talk about various forms of. Will we even define what AI is? I don't think anyone's done that yet. And even in this session, we talk about AI being just this kind of strange term that's just used to catch all the things that we think that we didn't think that we thought only humans would be able to do. So forms of human intelligence now that we can see that computers can do. So we talk about various forms. And then at the very end, we talk, well, actually throughout the entire book, we talk about this idea of equity and fairness, which Linda was touching on, and we talk about what it means to actually bake that into the things that we're using. As I said, we're releasing that soon. I can give more information on that. I'm out of time. Maybe we can address it more in the panel. But thank you.